Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 774 for June 30th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
People just shake their head and be like, it's been that long? And I'm like, yeah, it really has. I'm like, where did the last decade of my life go?
It is hard to believe, isn't it? 2009 was a big year for the craft distilling movement, and Wyoming Whiskey is one of many distilleries celebrating their 10th anniversaries this year. While some of the class of 2009 did not make it to 10 years, others have thrived by teaming up with larger spirits companies to get access to their distribution networks, and that's what Wyoming Whiskey did last year with Edrington. I'll talk with co-founder David DeFazio later on WhiskyCast In Depth. We'll also have the calendar of events, your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and much more, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's start off with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. The U.S. Supreme Court appears to have given spirits retailers a victory in their battle to open up interstate sales and shipments of spirits. The court ruled Wednesday against the state of Tennessee's required 2-year residency for liquor store license holders. The court held that constitutional protections for interstate commerce generally override state-specific protections for in-state businesses. In other words, states will not be allowed to ban retailers outside their borders from shipping to their residents if they allow in-state retailers to. Right now, only 12 states allow cross-border shipping from retailers, and legal analysts say other states will either have to change their laws or see them challenged in court. The court did not address whether states that control retail sales through a state agency will have to open their borders to out-of-state retailers. 13 states operate their own retail systems, while 4 other states serve as wholesalers with the exclusive right to supply privately owned retail stores. The justices did find that states have a legitimate interest in regulating the health and safety risks of alcohol sales, but that the Commerce Clause of the Constitution requires equal treatment for businesses located inside and outside of a state. While this decision is final, it'll set a precedent for resolving similar lawsuits that will likely be filed to challenge other state laws. And one of those challenges is already taking place in Texas, where a federal appeals court was likely waiting for this ruling before issuing its own opinion in Walmart's lawsuit against the state of Texas. Walmart has been challenging a Texas law that bans publicly traded companies from holding retail liquor licenses. In its ruling, the Supreme Court specifically mentioned part of Tennessee's law requiring all officers, directors, and shareholders of a corporation to meet the state's 2-year residency requirement, as essentially banning any publicly traded corporation from operating a liquor store. One more note along similar lines: Canada's new law removing federal bans on transporting alcohol across provincial lines has taken effect. However, many provinces have their own laws that either ban or limit the amount of alcohol one can take or ship across provincial borders. In other news, workers have almost completed the teardown of a rickhouse that collapsed nearly 2 weeks ago at the O.Z. Tyler Distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky. That's key because after the partial collapse during a thunderstorm on June 17th, engineers were afraid the rest of the rickhouse could come down during the barrel recovery work. Nearly 20,000 barrels of whiskey are being removed from the wreckage. Distillery spokesmen say there has been minimal leakage so far. Lots of new whiskeys to talk about this week. Chivas Brothers is digging deep into its archives for the Secret Speyside collection. It's a 15-bottle series of single malts from Longmorn, Glenkeith, Braes of Glenlivet, which is now known simply as Breval, and the long-closed Capardonic distillery. That one has the biggest piece of the collection, with 3 peated and 3 unpeated bottlings, while each of the other distilleries will have 3 bottles each. Chivas Brothers distilling director Alan Winchester helped curate the collection.
We've decided to show some that don't really get the spotlight, in a sense. Longmorn is one of the classics, mentioned in Aeneas MacDonald's book way back in the 1930s. In his top 11, he reckoned that Longmorn was one of those classics. But also to take the hidden sort of Braes of Glenlivet to the fore, a remote distillery. Also, Glenkeith, a fantastic landmark distillery in our side. So we're taking them to the fore, and also within it, we're showing great expressions of them within that. Going from the 18-year-old Longmorn right up, there's a 30-year-old Breval, a 30-year-old Capardonic. And again, the Capardonic's quite exciting in the sense that we've taken 6 versions of it, 3 unpeated and 3 peated, to show you what a Speyside whisky distillery with a good slaying of peat in it looks like.
Is this some of the last stocks you have of Capardonic?
There's quite the amount of stocks we have. We have some Capardonic in stock, of course, because to support sort of other things. But stopped production in 2002, so you're quite right, Mark. It's got an infinite stock there. So when it goes, that will be the last of it.
Winchester says this project has been in the works for several years, and each one of the distilleries has a special meaning for him.
Capardonic was a distillery I made whiskey with in early part of my career before moving to Glenkeith, which Glenkeith distillery where I had my first managerial step in the ladder. The Braes, we unfortunately had to close it in 2002, but the great news was we reopened it in 2008. And then, of course, Longmorn, that classic. It's often described as where the distillers are their whiskey to go to, other than the one that you're representing. But we've all a great respect for Longmorn as well.
They'll be available at first in global travel retail starting in July, with plans to release them into selected domestic markets a year from now. No word yet on pricing. 80 years ago, Heaven Hill released its first bourbon, a 4-year-old bottled in bond bourbon. And for many years, the 6-year-old Heaven Hill bottled in bond was one of Kentucky's best-kept secrets. It was dropped a couple of years ago, but now Heaven Hill is releasing a new 7-year-old bottled in bond bourbon this fall. It'll be available at first in California, Texas, New York, Georgia, Florida, Illinois, South Carolina, and Colorado for around $40 a bottle. Brown-Forman's King of Kentucky bourbon brand was revived last year, and the 2019 release was unveiled this week. It's a 15-year-old uncut single-barrel bourbon with about 2,000 bottles available from 27 different barrels. It'll sell for around $250 a bottle, and I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Last October, Maker's Mark introduced a 101-proof version of its bourbon in the travel retail market. Now it'll be available in Kentucky at the distillery in Loretto, along with a handful of retail locations in the state. Look for a price tag of $49.99 a bottle. Also out of Kentucky, Michter's is out with its 2019 release of 10-year-old rye whiskey. This is the first release for new master distiller Dan McKee since he took over for Pam Heilman a couple of months ago. You can hear my April interview with Dan and Pam in episode 765 at WhiskyCast.com. I mentioned Distillery 291 in Colorado Springs a couple of weeks ago during our Tasting Notes segment. They'll be releasing batch number 6 of their E-Colorado whiskey this Wednesday at the distillery. The E stands for experimental, and took their 291 Colorado bourbon and finished it for 7 months. The finishing barrels were first used at the distillery, then loaned out to a local winery to use for peach and cherry wine before returning to the distillery. Speyburn recently released a new 18-year-old single malt to coincide with Bobby Anderson's 18th anniversary as distillery manager. It's now available in the U.S. with 9,000 bottles available each year. The recommended retail price, $125 each. The Whiskey Exchange is teaming up with Signatory for a collection of single malts to mark its 20th anniversary this year. There are 5 whiskeys available in the lineup, from a 4-year-old Bunnahabhain Stoisha to 23-year-old whiskeys from Clynelish and Glenbergie. Prices range from £53.95 to £155. That's around $68.50 to $197 at current exchange rates. There was a 6th bottling in the series, a 10-year-old Clynelish, but it sold out within a day or two. Weems Malts has added 2 new blended malt Scotch whiskies to its range. Blooming Gorse is a blend of 2 Highland malts, while Flaming Feast brings together 2 peated whiskies from the Highlands. They're available in the UK, Europe, and Asia. And from Australia, Sullivan's Cove is releasing a new 12-year-old single cask bottling. It has spent that entire time in a French oak cask first used for Australian white wine. Only 327 bottles are available through the Sullivan's Cove website. The price tag, $400 Australian, around $280 US. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan, it's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. We are really proud of the growth in the WhiskyCast audience over the last couple of years, but I know there are still a lot of whiskey lovers out there who have not discovered the podcast yet. You can help us with that this week. Please tell your friends about WhiskyCast, and if they're not familiar with podcasts, show them how to use the Podcasts app on their phone and subscribe to WhiskyCast. Every iPhone and most Android phones come with a podcast app built in, and you can also subscribe to WhiskyCast on the Spotify, Pandora, Radio.com, iHeartRadio, and a bunch of other apps, too. Thanks for your support, and remember, friends don't let friends miss out on podcasts. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Lots going on all over the world of whiskey during July. Whiskey Live Sydney is this coming weekend in Sydney, Australia. Maker's Mark Distillery has its Live from Loretto music nights almost every Friday night between now and October in Loretto, Kentucky. Mahesh Patel from the Nth and the Universal Whiskey Experience is leading a whiskey tasting this coming Saturday night in Anchorage, Alaska, to benefit Habitat for Humanity. The Whiskey Rebellion Festival is July 11th through the 14th in Washington, Pennsylvania, and on the other side of the state, Raj Sabarwal will lead an Amrit tasting on the 14th in Philadelphia. Sagamore Spirit's next Whiskey on the Waterfront concert is July 20th in Baltimore, Maryland. The Only Whiskey Show is July 25th and 26th in Sandton, South Africa. And Ironhouse Distillery will have a release party for its first Tasmanian single malt, July 27th in South Burnie, Australia. Right now, we have 213 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com, and we're adding new events all the time. Just click on the search button to find events near you or wherever you'll be traveling in the months to come. Grab a bourbon and settle into a good story. Heaven Hill's Backroom Stories, told by those who've rarely shared before just how they shape the spirit and just how the spirit shapes them.
All the barrels are aging here. A lot of the airflow through the warehouse like this, when you open the door, all that goodness hits you in the face. And, it's something you never forget.
Download and listen to the new podcast, Tales from the Hill, from Heaven Hill Distillery. It's coming soon to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlach. 2009 was a big year for the U.S. craft distilling movement, with more than 30 new distilleries coming online that year. While a few didn't make it, those that did are celebrating their 10th anniversaries this year. This week, Wyoming Whiskey will mark the 10th anniversary of its first still run on July 4th, 2009. We've covered the Wyoming Whiskey story in a lot of details over the years on WhiskyCast, including our WhiskyCast HD video segment from their first bottle release on December 1st, 2012. Brad and Kate Mead decided to build the distillery on their ranch in Kirby, Wyoming, and they convinced their former law partner, David DeFazio, to come on board and run the company. While they decided to join forces with Edrington last year to secure distribution for the future, the founders still own a majority of Wyoming Whiskey, and David DeFazio is still running the company on a day-to-day basis. We spent some time on the phone this week talking about the last 10 years and what the future holds. You've got a couple of new whiskeys coming to celebrate the 10th anniversary, don't you? Let's talk about those first.
Sure. The two that you're referencing are going to be Statesman and Stargazer. Statesman is going to be a Wyoming-only release that we've been working on for a while now, and is the third edition in our Wyoming-only series. As you recall, we had an Eclipse 2 years ago to celebrate the eclipse coming across Wyoming. Last year was Steamboat, and this year, in a much more limited quantity, is going to be Statesman. This is a product that pays tribute to Senator Cliff Hansen, who's Brad's grandfather. I know you and I have talked about him before.
Right.
And this whole series is really devoted to paying tribute to the most iconic figures, events, etc., in Wyoming. And there really is no greater figure when it comes to, especially politicians, but also ranchers, than Senator Hansen.
And then you've got a new Outrider coming too, right?
Yes. Outrider is going to be coming out this fall, kind of late summer, early fall. And I don't know if you and I have discussed this previously, but last year we skipped our bottling. We knew that the partnership with Edrington was imminent, and we kind of wanted to keep our powder dry and work with Edrington to make sure that we were using that product in the best way possible. So we've held it, and as a result, the product that we'll be coming out with this fall will have a new package and will be 2 years older than our last release. And I have tasted the two base whiskeys that we will be using to make it, as we always have, and I can tell you that they are just absolutely spectacular. So I'm really excited about both of these because I think they represent some whiskeys that are slightly on the richer side, a little more complex than some of our others. Not to say one is better than the other, but it's fun now that we've got such an inventory of barrels to choose from. We could start, having some fun and releasing some things that are a little different than what most people are used to from us.
And I think a lot of people are going to go, wow, when they realize that July marks the 10th anniversary of when you guys opened the distillery in Kirby.
Yeah, I mentioned it a couple of times in the last week, actually, and people just shake their head and be like, it's been that long? And I'm like, yeah, it really has. I'm like, where did the last decade of my life go? But we're really excited about it. It's, when you start a project like this, obviously you have great intentions and you're very optimistic about success, but you never know how it's going to go. And now that we find ourselves, where we are with the inventory that we do, with the quality of product that we have, and in a partnership with Edrington, we're pretty happy about it. So it'll definitely be a good 10th year celebration.
Will there be any other new whiskeys coming out, maybe say around December 1st to mark the anniversary of the first bottle?
So
which will be 7
years. A few
years.
More years. So this is the 10th anniversary of production.
Right.
So we turned everything on July 4th, but when it comes to the actual release of our first product, we don't have anything planned this year for that. Come 10 years, so 12/1/12 being our first launch date, I think you'll see, in a couple more years, we'll be doing something really special for that event. We've already had some ideas tossed around on what we'd like to do. So I'm not going to speak now to that because I think it's far too early and premature, but you'll see some exciting things from us come when we're celebrating that 10th anniversary.
Now, a lot of those early barrels that were filled were for your bourbon barons out in Wyoming, your early barrel sales. How many of those you still have left?
We have a handful of them, and people have been sitting on them waiting for them to hit that 10-year mark. Barrel 21 in particular was the very first barrel that we sold, and it was sold to a gentleman by the name of Keith Lenkeek and a bunch of his buddies who all chipped in and invested in it. He visited the distillery not long ago to sample his barrel, and he was thrilled. Sam has pulled a couple of samples from those barrels for folks over the last couple of years, and a number of them are sitting on them, and kind of waiting for that 10th year mark, and potentially even longer. So I'd say we probably have 4 of those still sitting there, maybe 5 from the very first release, and yeah, it's an exciting thing. I just can't believe that we've got product that's 10 years old within the next, few weeks.
What's the biggest thing you learned over the last 10 years?
That Max Shapiro was 100% right when we spoke to him before we started this project. He said it was going to take 3 times as long, cost 3 times as much, and be 3 times as difficult as you think. And he was dead on. Brad and I laugh about it all the time. But it's been... there's a lot more to that. That's the quick and easy, dirty answer. But, it's the big picture of building a distillery, and you can't just focus on one component of it, really. You have to be thinking a couple steps ahead. You've got to have a greater plan. You've got to be constantly working on the quality of your product. You've always got to be questioning, are we doing it right? And if we are, is there a better way still? All of those things that, anybody who runs a distillery, I think is probably asking themselves, on a daily, if not weekly or monthly basis. Then the question becomes, do I have the time to do all of those things? And if you don't, then it becomes an exercise in priorities. What is the most important thing that I need to be focusing on at this point? And what's the secondary and tertiary and on down the line? So, I think that's a conversation that we could probably have for hours about what we've learned and, whatnot. But I would say that's the short answer.
But you wouldn't change a thing.
I would change one thing, and that would have been when we released. I think we probably would have sat on our product a little bit longer right out of the gate. But other than that, no. I'm proud of everything that we've done, Bringing Steve Nally on in the beginning was one of the greatest things that could have happened to us. It gave us instant credibility and a foundation upon which to build the brand. Bringing Sam in, who took Steve's role and really focused on how can we improve our process and moving forward in that direction and asking all the right questions. And then we've always let the whiskey kind of lead the conversation as far as what's our next product. I think sometimes you can get caught up in trying to create a product out of what you have that may not necessarily fit with what the product is, and we've never done that. Our barrel strength, for example, we didn't go looking for the best barrels in the warehouse in order to create a product. We stumbled upon one or two, and it dictated that we needed to come up with a new product. Same thing with Outrider. I mean, the story of Outrider, and necessity is the mother of invention, and we have these great barrels, and we had to do something spectacular with them, and hence the birth of Outrider.
And let's explain that story again for those who didn't hear it the first time. Let's explain that story again.
It's a classic. As you know, Steve Nally came from Maker's Mark, and he was a wheated bourbon maker, and that's what he believed was the way to make bourbon. And when we're talking almost 10 years ago now, I approached him and asked him, to see what he would think about making a rye, because the trade publications had started to indicate there was a little bit of a blip, like people were getting interested in this. And as you know, you got to be looking a long way down the line. We had to grow our grains and all that stuff. So he said, I don't want to make rye. And I said, why is that? And he goes, rye sucks. And I just laughed, and I said, well, hold on a second. I said, it doesn't really matter what you think or what I think, but, consumers are starting to say that they want this. There was a demand. And he said, I don't want to make rye. Well, it took a lot of convincing of my partner, Brad, to believe that this was the right thing to do. And we had to twist the arm of a 6'5" master distiller who was in the Bourbon Hall of Fame and try to tell him to do something he didn't want to do. And that's a difficult task. So it took a little bit of work, but he ultimately begrudgingly agreed to do it. And he made a bourbon with corn, rye, and barley. And then he made a, quote, rye. And I use the quotes intentionally. So years later, we only did this for one season. It was in November and December of 2011 is when he laid this down. And he cleaned the entire system after it was done because he said it had fouled the system. It was very dramatic. But that was it. And I didn't ask him to do it again because, candidly, I didn't want to go through the process of trying to convince him that this was worth it. But it certainly was, because years after he left, Nancy Fraley and Sam were sitting down, and I had asked them to try through these two different whiskeys. And the reports back from them were that this was some of the best young rye that they had ever tried. And coming from Nancy in particular, that's high praise. So we kept a close eye on it, and we revisited it a year later when it was approaching 4 years of age, and she said, I think this is ready. And we all agreed, well, wait a second, we've been through this before. Let's wait until it's 5 years of age, because we had agreed that would be our base age for all of our whiskeys. And so we got to thinking about what kind of a label we want, how do we want to do this, what's the marketing campaign going to look like. And the first question is, well, what's the mash bill on the rye? So I called Sam and asked him that question, and he said, you're not going to believe this, but it's only 48% rye. And I said, wait a second, do the math again. He goes, I've done it 6 times. It's only 48% rye. Do you want me to tell you it's 51%? And I said, no, you can't do that. But we panicked. I called Brad, and I told him what situation we were in, and we didn't know what to do because now we didn't have a rye. The whole plan was foiled, and we had to come up with a new plan. So in visiting with Sam and Nancy and Brad, it was decided that we could do a kind of a blend and take a 2-to-1 ratio of the bourbon made with rye with the almost rye in order to come up with this product. And so that's what we did the first year. We did 44 barrels of the bourbon and 22 of the almost rye. But we didn't have a name, and this was in the very amorphous, unsexy category of straight American whiskey. So we wondered what to call it, and a couple of names were immediately rejected, and we just were having a really hard time settling on something. So I called Steve for inspiration. And after we exchanged some pleasantries and kind of caught up on what had been going on, and as you know, Steve's a total gentleman, I asked him, I said, so Steve, man, I want you to know that rye you made is absolutely spectacular. And he said, good. I'm really happy for you. And I said, but man, we're having a hell of a time trying to figure out what to do with it or what to call it because it's only 48% rye. And I said, so why did you only use 48% rye? And he said, because I told you I didn't want to make rye. And my job bounced off of my desk. I couldn't believe that this was an intentional act. I wanted to call it Defiance immediately, but there was already a Defiant whiskey out there, and we stayed away from that. And we ultimately landed on Outrider because it really is, I think, a good descriptor of what we had to do, because these were kind of stray barrels that we had to collect and bring together for something magical, much like the Outriders on the range are always keeping the calves in with the herd. It was a name actually that Brad Mead came up with, and I thought it was absolutely perfect. So that's the story behind Outrider and Steve's Defiance. I know he waited 5 years for that phone call.
Because he knew it was coming at some point as soon as you guys figured out what he'd done.
Yep.
Could have called it Master Distiller's Revenge.
Yeah. Well, somebody said recently, so we've started making a true rye at 51% because we really liked the recipe that Steve had used, albeit 3 points shy of what we wanted it to be. And I was told this story not long ago, and a person in the audience said, you should call the new rye Steve. So I'm considering that.
And we should point out that, as you noted, Steve is 6'5", and neither you nor Brad are anywhere close to 6'5".
No, he's got me by a few inches there, and he's a gentle giant, but I wouldn't want to piss him off.
So what's this I hear about you guys finally outgrowing your capacity after 10 years and going to have to expand out there?
We've got some big plans moving forward, Mark, and we built the distillery with a plan to expand at some point. The footprint of the actual facility was built to at least double our fermentation, which was the pinch in our process. And now that we are in a partnership with Edrington, who's given us a sales and distribution boost, to say it not mildly, we have all agreed that we are going to need more product 5, 6, 7 years down the line. So we have increased our fermentation capacity by 150%, and that comes online here very soon. So we're really excited about that. We don't need to do anything on the distillation side. We haven't been using our still to full capacity, but that's about to happen, like I said, in a couple of weeks. And we have 2 warehouses that are currently under construction and will be completed very soon. And we're really excited about it. This whole partnership has been something that it's the greatest thing that happened to us because, as any small distiller knows, the sales and distribution component of it is the most challenging component of it. You can make an absolutely brilliant whiskey, vodka, gin, whatever, but unless you've got an effective, route to market, it's going to be difficult to grow. It's going to be difficult to grow. So, I think it fits in nicely with where we're at and where we want to be in 5 years.
And that's sort of where we've seen a lot of the changes coming in the industry, because it's not just you guys teaming up with Edrington, but the deal we saw just a few days ago with Rabbit Hole teaming up with Pernod Ricard. Same thing with Smooth Ambler before that, with Catoctin Creek teaming up with Constellation Brands and High West doing the same thing, and Constellation buying High West outright. A lot of the small distilleries that are going to make it are going to have to team up with a bigger partner just to solve this distribution issue.
Yes, or remain, in a smaller market and be, comfortable in that space. And I think that some of these smaller distilleries do like that smaller space, and that's a perfectly fine business model. We set out with aspirations of being America's next great bourbon, and for companies like us, you will need to partner with somebody who has that distribution line. It's a fact of life. It's a fact of the industry. Without that, it's going to be really difficult. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, in trying to get attention from distributors, it really all comes down to the bottom line. Are you going to make our company money with your product or not? And if the answer is no, then they're not going to do too much to grow you. I mean, a lot of them are very plain, have a plain statement up front. It's like, we're not brand builders. We are distributors, and we've got a network that will adequately do that for you, but, you're really, you, meaning the supplier, need to be the driving force behind brand building. And small distillers just don't have the resources to get that done a lot of times. They don't have the marketing dollars. They don't have an independent sales force that's going out there and, getting people's attention. And that's the difficulty. That is the difficulty in the industry, if you ask me.
So what's the best thing Edrington has brought to the table other than that sales and distribution network?
An organization and sophistication that we needed when it comes to all of the processes from the moment the grain is received all the way through to when it's delivered to a retailer. They have been in the whiskey world with, arguably the best, if not one of the best scotches in the world, and the ability to bring that to the consumer in an effective way. And by effective, I mean being able to explain why it's such a special product, why there's only a limited amount of it, and why, the price tag is, it's worth every penny that you're going to pay for it. Being with a company that is so successful in that arena, and in the whiskey arena in particular, it's incredibly helpful. And they have their own commercial team or sales force, a little army that we never had the luxury of having when we were an independent. And I would say we're still, quote, independent, but being in a partnership with them, it gives us access to that, and it helps so much because they are very educated, they're very sophisticated, and they're able to go out there and deliver a message to retailers, to all of the vendors out there, from restaurants and bars and whatnot, that we just simply couldn't do on our own. So they bring a top-to-bottom level of sophistication that fits in perfectly with our culture as a company, and as a result, I know that our company is far better for it. And we will be able to bring the option of Wyoming whiskey to those people who would like to try it, and we just couldn't do that before.
I thought it was just because they wanted your used barrels.
I don't know if I'm at liberty to discuss that, Mark, about what they're doing with it, but that's part of the deal, and there might be some cross-pollination on that as well. I'm not really at liberty to talk about that either at this point, but you might see some exciting things coming from us in the future regarding shared barrel use, not only just with their Scotch brands, but also their rum brand, tequila brand, etc. I mean, Partita and Brugal are both, fantastic companies that are doing great things, and the ability to tap into those barrels are going to give us an option that we didn't have previously as well.
We briefly mentioned Wyoming Whiskey's new Stargazer release during the conversation. It's a distillery-only release that will go on sale July 20th to mark another anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. The distillery is holding a special event that night that will include stargazing with high-powered telescopes and a presentation by University of Wyoming astronomy professor Daniel Dale. There's a link for details in our calendar of events section at whiskycast.com. And that's WhiskyCast in Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Since Monday is Canada Day, let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the new Crown Royal Noble Collection release. This year's edition is finished in French oak casks, and it's bottled at 40% ABV. The nose has notes of plums, figs, and dates, along with a hint of molasses, vanilla, and muted spices. The taste is thick and syrupy with dark fruits and hints of white pepper and allspice, while touches of molasses, vanilla, and peaches add complexity in the background. The finish is long with lingering spices, dark fruits, and a hint of molasses. I'm scoring the Crown Royal Noble Collection French Oak Cask-Finished Canadian Whiskey a 92. Of course, Independence Day is this Thursday in the U.S., and since bourbon is officially America's native spirit, let's look at the 2019 King of Kentucky 15-year-old single-barrel bourbon that I mentioned during the news. There are 27 different barrels that were bottled for this year's release, and my sample came from barrel number 8. It was bottled at 65.5% ABV. And the nose is rich, nutty, and intense, with caramel, honey, oak, a hint of apricots, and spices just waiting to explode, sort of like a sprinter at the starting line. That explosion comes in the form of clove, cinnamon, and cardamom spices on the palate that eventually fade to reveal oak tannins, honey, caramel, and subtle touches of fruit. This one is a whiskey that cries out for water. I usually add just a few drops with an eyedropper, but it took 3 times that to even make a dent in this whiskey. When it does, look for more caramel, hints of cocoa, and an even more tannic touch of oak. The spices stick around through the long finish, which becomes slightly astringent with a hint of apples. I'm scoring the 2019 King of Kentucky bourbon from Brown-Forman a 94. Now, while bourbon may officially be America's native spirit, the country was actually founded on rye whiskey, as we heard back in May, during episode 766 with Brian Tracy of Sagamore Spirit. High West is out with its 2019 edition of Yippee-Ki-Yay, its annual blend of its own young rye with older ryes from Kentucky and Indiana. As usual, it's bottled at 46% ABV, and the nose has a healthy touch of cinnamon, along with chocolate-covered cherries, toasted oak, brown sugar, and just a hint of mesquite seasoning. The taste has a good balance of cinnamon, vanilla, cherries, cedar, and a hint of anise, while the finish has touches of raspberries and licorice, along with lingering spices. I'm scoring the High West 2019 edition of Yippee-Ki-Yay Rye a 92. And let's wrap it up with the new release of Michter's 10-year-old straight rye. Once again, this one is the first for Dan McKee as Michter's master distiller. It's bottled at 46.4% ABV, and the nose is complex with classic rye spices, charred oak, cocoa, tobacco, leather, and a hint of caramel. The taste is spicy with clove, black pepper, and allspice, balanced nicely by licorice, brown sugar, caramel, and cocoa. The finish is long and smooth with a touch of licorice. And I'm scoring the 2019 release of Michter's 10-year-old straight rye a 90. I'm adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of tasting notes for more than 2,600 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at WhiskyCast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, brought to you by Lot 40. If you're following us on Twitter, you may have seen the occasional tweet from Ashley Penny at Ash Loves Whiskey. He's one of a bunch of people over the years who have discovered WhiskyCast, get caught up on recent episodes, and then decide to go back and listen from the very beginning. That was back in November of 2005, and it used to be a lot easier to do. Anyway, Ashley tweeted this week from Ireland. Episode 412. The first time hearing of Jack Teeling releasing Teeling Small Batch and dreaming of his own distillery, and so the revival began. Hashtag Teeling Whiskey. For the record, that episode was released on February 16th, 2013. Ashley, you only have 6 years' worth of episodes left to go. Now, this week's whiskey photo of the week shows an example of how people in the whiskey industry support each other. It's of one of the founding fathers' barrels at Dingle Distillery in Ireland, but this one was purchased by Middleton Distillery back when Dingle was selling casks to help pay the bills in its early startup days. At Scotchology1 tweeted this, "Always love seeing that collaboration. With whiskey consumption so high globally, it would seem there is more to be gained from cooperation than competition, or as the folks at Copperworks Distillery call it, coopertition." Mark Hancheroff at mhanch on Twitter echoed that. "My good friend at Humbaba2112 is one of the owners of Burke Brewing and has described local brewers to be much the same to each other. A rising tide lifts all beers. Or is that boats?" After we mentioned on Twitter the other day that Maker's Mark would start selling its 101 proof edition in Kentucky this week, Rarebird 101, who usually sticks to wild turkey comments on Twitter, asked this, "Is there any maturation difference between Maker's Mark Cask Strength, and Maker's Mark 101? Is water, parentheses, and price the only difference?" Yeah, that's about it. They're all matured for between 5.5 to 6 years or so, last time I checked. The only differences apply to Maker's 46 and the Maker's Mark Private Select casks, which get finished with different types of barrel staves after their original maturation. If you have a question, suggestion, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that all combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And you may have noticed that we're starting to see a trend back toward age statements on Scotch whiskies. Over the last year, the Glenrothes and Balblair have both replaced their ranges of whiskies that were labeled with the vintage year when they were distilled, and both have gone back to age statements. Let's emphasize that neither brand has stated this publicly as a specific reason for making that change, but one reason could be that the Treasury Department's Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, is tightening up on its enforcement on some of the restrictions on labeling. There's been a rule for years that if a label makes any representation to the age or maturity of a distilled spirit, then the actual age has to be stated on the label. Vintage years fall into that category, and according to the TTB's Thomas Hogue, the term vintage year is associated with a date of harvest, say for the grapes that go into a particular year's wine. And that term really does not apply to distilled spirits. Yes, the grain for whiskeys is harvested, but it is possible to use grain from more than 1 year's harvests in making whiskeys. So the rule is that if a distillation date, such as a year, appears on the label, then a storage statement has to appear with it on the label. For instance, a whiskey labeled as a 2010 vintage would have to have something along the lines of aged 8 years in oak casks right alongside it. So it's pretty much easier just to call it a 12-year-old whiskey. And once again, while they have not come right out and said that, It appears that that's what Bell Blair and the Glenrothes might have been thinking when they came out with their new lineups. If there's something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD video segments and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast. You'll also find the latest whiskey news, tasting notes, the whiskey photo of the week, cocktail recipes, and a complete archive of past episodes that go all the way back to 2005. Once again, please take just a minute this week to tell a friend about WhiskyCast. And if you're not already subscribing to WhiskyCast with Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app, please take a minute this week and click on the subscribe button. That way you won't miss a single episode. We'd love to hear from you. Get in touch with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.